First, let's talk about the building. Most medieval families, we're talking about 90% of the population, lived in simple structures that would shock us today. These weren't the stone cottages you see in movies. Instead, picture a 1 or 2 room building made from whatever materials were locally available. In England and Northern Europe, this meant wattle and daub construction. Wooden frames filled with woven sticks and plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. The roof? Thatched with straw or reeds, which needed replacing every 20 to 30 years. In regions with more trees, homes might be entirely wooden. In areas with accessible stone, wealthier peasants might incorporate some stonework, but this was relatively rare for common folk. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that would be replaced periodically. Wooden floors were a luxury reserved for those with more means. And here's something that surprises people. Many homes had no chimney. Smoke from the central hearth would simply filter up through the thatch or out through a hole in the roof. Purpose-built chimneys didn't become common in ordinary homes until the late medieval period, around the 15th century. The absolute center of medieval domestic life was the hearth. This wasn't just a fireplace. It was the family's source of heat, light, and the only way to cook food. In most peasant homes, the hearth sat in the middle of the main room, with the smoke rising to the rafters before escaping through the roof. The hearth itself might be a simple circle of stones on the earth floor, or in better homes, a slightly raised platform. Families would have possessed fire-making tools, flint and steel for striking sparks, and tinder boxes containing charcloth or dried fungus to catch those precious sparks. Keeping the fire going was crucial because restarting it was labor-intensive. Many families would bank their fires at night, covering the coals with ash to keep embers alive until morning. Around the hearth, you'd find the cooking equipment: an iron pot or cauldron suspended from a chain or hook, possibly a griddle for cooking flatbreads, and iron pokers for managing the fire. These metal items represented significant investments. A good iron pot might be passed down through generations and would be mentioned specifically in wills. Here's where we need to shatter some expectations. The average medieval family home had remarkably little furniture. We're talking about a few essential pieces, and that's it. The most important piece was the trestle table. Unlike the heavy tables we know today, medieval tables often consisted of boards laid across trestle supports. Why? Because space was precious, and these tables could be disassembled and leaned against the wall when not in use, creating more living space. The table served for eating, working, and various household tasks. For seating, forget chairs. Chairs with backs were status symbols, reserved for the head of household if the family was prosperous enough to own even one. Most people sat on benches, 3-legged stools, or simply on chests. 3-legged stools were particularly practical because they remained stable on uneven earthen floors. Storage came in the form of chests and coffers. These served multiple purposes, storing clothing, linens, food, and valuables, but also functioning as seats and sometimes even beds. A family might own 1 to 3 chests depending on their means. Shelves were rare. Most items were kept in chests or hung from hooks on the walls. Now for something that really differs from our modern expectations: beds. Wealthy peasants might own an actual bed frame, but for most families, sleeping arrangements were far simpler. The typical setup involved straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the floor or on simple platforms. These pallets would be rolled up during the day to save space. Bedding consisted of rough woolen blankets, and perhaps a bolster filled with straw or chaff for a pillow. Linen sheets were a luxury item that only wealthier households possessed. In colder months, families would pile on whatever they had. Extra clothing, animal skins, more blankets. Here's something crucial. Most people didn't sleep alone in separate beds. Families slept together for warmth, and even in households that could afford multiple beds, sharing was common. Privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. The medieval kitchen, such as it was, contained remarkably few items compared to our modern homes. For cooking, a family might have one large iron pot, perhaps a smaller pot, and maybe a frying pan or griddle if they were fortunate. A large wooden spoon, a knife or two, and possibly a skimmer made from metal or wood rounded out the cooking implements. Food preparation happened on the table or on a board. Cutting boards, wooden bowls, and simple tools like pestles and mortars for grinding were essential. Wealthier families might own a brass or bronze mortar, but wooden versions were more common. For eating, each family member might have a wooden bowl and a wooden or horn spoon. Forks didn't exist for dining. People ate with their hands, their personal knife, and a spoon. Trenchers were common, thick slices of stale bread that served as edible plates, soaking up the juices from whatever was served on them. After the meal, these bread plates would be eaten or given to animals or the poor. Cups and mugs were made from wood, leather, or pottery. Glass was extraordinarily rare and expensive. Even pewter vessels were signs of relative prosperity. Most families drank from simple wooden or ceramic cups. Textiles were among the most valuable possessions in a medieval home. Making cloth was incredibly labor-intensive, so every piece of fabric had real worth. A typical family's textile possessions would include the clothes on their backs, perhaps one change of clothing if they were lucky, and a few blankets. Men typically wore a tunic, brazier kind of underwear, hose leg coverings, and a hood or cap. Women wore a long tunic or gown, an undershift, and a head covering. Colors were generally natural: browns, greys, undyed wool tones. Bright colors required expensive dyes and were markers of wealth. These garments would be mended repeatedly, patched, and worn until they literally fell apart. When clothing became too worn for regular use, it would be repurposed as rags, bandages, or patches for other clothing. Nothing was wasted. The family might own a distaff and spindle for spinning thread, and possibly a small loom if they produced their own cloth. Many rural families processed at least some of their own wool or flax. Sewing needles, made of bone or metal, were precious tools carefully guarded. Every household possessed tools related to their work and survival. For a peasant family, this meant agricultural tools, which might include a spade, hoe, sickle for harvesting grain, and perhaps a scythe. These tools were valuable enough to be listed in estate inventories and were maintained carefully. Inside the home, you'd find practical items: buckets wooden, perhaps a churn for making butter, baskets woven from willow or other flexible materials, rope or cord, and knives of various sizes. A whetstone for sharpening tools would be essential. If the family kept animals, equipment related to animal husbandry would be present. Milk pails, simple harnesses, tools for shearing sheep. Many families had chickens, and some kept a pig or goat, so feed containers and basic animal care equipment would be on hand. Once the sun set, medieval homes became dark places. Firelight from the hearth provided the main source of illumination, but families might supplement this with simple oil lamps or rushlights. Rushlights were made by repeatedly dipping dried rushes in animal fat. They burned quickly, produced smoke, and gave off a weak, flickering light, but they were cheap to make. Candles existed but were relatively expensive. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were more affordable than beeswax but smelled terrible when burning. Wealthy households used beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and smelled pleasant, but these were far beyond the means of ordinary families. A peasant household might reserve 1 or 2 candles for special occasions or emergencies. Lanterns to protect flames from wind were made from horn scraped thin enough to be translucent. These were practical items but still represented an investment. It's worth noting what was notably absent from medieval homes. There were no mirrors as we know them. Polished metal mirrors existed but were luxury items. No books or paper in ordinary homes. Literacy was uncommon, and books were hand-copied treasures. No clocks. Time was marked by the sun, church bells, and the rhythm of agricultural seasons. There were no separate bathrooms. People used chamber pots, which were emptied into cesspits or middens, or they simply went outside to designated areas. Personal hygiene involved washing from a bowl or basin, and full-body bathing was infrequent. And obviously, nothing manufactured from plastic, nothing mass-produced, no decorative items just for aesthetics. Every object in the home served a practical purpose. It was sparse, practical, and centered around survival and work rather than comfort or decoration. Everything owned had to justify its existence through utility. The medieval home reminds us how much our material expectations have changed. What we consider basic necessities would have been unimaginable luxuries to most people in the Middle Ages. Their entire household possessions might fit in a few boxes by our standards, yet within these simple walls, families lived, loved, worked, and built the foundation of the world we live in today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into medieval life, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical deep dives. What surprised you most about medieval homes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos exploring daily life in history, check out the videos I've linked in the description. See you in the next one.